Have you ever wondered what happens on the battlefield after a World War II confrontation? What happened to the fallen soldiers, weapons, and material? How was the area cleared? What were the civilians doing there? And when the war reporters arrived at the place of battle, are some of the many aspects that we will analyze below. And it is that although we always study and analyze the evolution of the battle, today we are going to see what happened in the place after the end of the fighting. Before we begin, we must indicate that obviously there was no general rule, nor did all sides act in the same way, and of course, the circumstances of the moment had a great influence on how to proceed. So, what we are going to report is what happened on a regular basis. The first thing that we have to be clear about as an introduction is that an army is divided into many units, each of them having a function. The one that is always valued is the shock unit that actively participates in the battle, these being the frontline soldiers. These units are busy fighting and have no time for anything else. Behind them are other types of soldiers who are in charge of construction, logistics, partisan control, recovery units, and many more. Thus, while after the end of a combat the shock divisions continue to advance rapidly to reach the objective of the operation, the battlefield remains littered with the remains of the confrontation. These units barely have time to tend to their wounded, grab some kind of material that they can reuse on the spot, and continue to move quickly. Next, other types of units arrive on the battlefield that are basically responsible for recovering as much material as possible, and identifying and dealing with fallen soldiers. All these tasks have to be carried out with the utmost care, because the terrain can be full of mines and projectiles of all kinds that have not yet exploded. Even today, mines and projectiles are still being found that must be detonated with care, such as in certain areas in Russia, in the Silo Hills themselves, and even in the Ardennes forest where there are sections that remain closed due to the danger posed get into them. As you can imagine, it is very important that your army is the one that advances when it comes to recovering material from the battlefield. As is evident, the army that retreats has to leave behind all the material that it has not been able to transport and any vehicle that has suffered a breakdown, no matter how small. This was a very serious problem for the Red Army during the first phase of the campaign on the Eastern Front, and later for the Germans from the summer of 1943. At the same time that all the material that can be recovered, so that it is available again for the combat units as soon as possible, the identification and burial of the fallen soldiers is carried out. Although the previous point was something that was repeated and was done as a general rule in all armies, in this one we cannot say the same, since it depends a lot on the side and the circumstances. In the first place, we have to say that as a general rule the fallen soldiers of the side that had won the battle were identified as far as possible and were buried in the place itself, or in large cemeteries that were prepared for the occasion. It must be said that the latter was not very common and that it was rather done at the end of the war, gathering all the soldiers who were buried throughout the region in one place. During the Battle of Normandy this was done very conscientiously by the Allies, and from the very beginning the soldiers of each side were buried separately in places close to the battle. This was repeated in most of the clashes that took place on the Western Front until the end of the war. On the Eastern Front, the Germans buried their fallen in cemeteries near the site of battle, while the Soviets used to bury them in large mass graves. The Soviets, for their part, did not have much concern for their dead soldiers, much less for those of the enemy, so on many occasions they used those large common graves for all the soldiers, and they were buried without identification. Finally, we have to say that some fallen soldier could be repatriated to his country to be buried with honors and in an official cemetery, although this was used with high command of the army. Of course, before being buried, these enemy soldiers were searched and stripped of any valuables they might have. On all sides, soldiers were allowed to send home packages in which they could send anything of value to their families. Another important activity that was done on the battlefield once the confrontation was over, was to film it for the national news. And it is that although we think that the images that we see have been recorded during the battle, the vast majority are representations that have been made after. When a country is at war, the most important thing of all is not to report realistically, because what is intended is always to make propaganda. For this, it is necessary to show soldiers from good visual planes and with a certain aesthetic, which is often complicated in real combat. In addition, war reporters try to be as safe as possible, and being present on the front lines while the fighting is taking place is not very advisable. Due to all this, the vast majority of videos that we see of the First and Second World War are montages that have been recorded after the battle. To close this chapter, we have to highlight, for example, the two most famous photographs and films of this contest, being those of Iwo Jima and that of the Soviet flag in Berlin. Both were montages that were made after the end of the combats and were prepared for the occasion, as we analyzed a few months ago in a program. Well, at this point, we have the following situation. The soldiers who have won the battle have already left and have continued to advance. The recovery teams have already removed the material that could be repaired and reused. The fallen soldiers have already been buried, the casualty count has been carried out, and the filming for the news has already been done. Despite all this, it is clear that the land is still full of debris of all kinds. So what happens next? Well, neither more nor less than the civilians' turn has come. The majority of the civilian population who had the misfortune that the fighting took place near their homes lost everything. So in this time of scarcity and misery you have to take advantage of any opportunity you have, so going to take over everything you can on an old battlefield is one of your best options. Due to the abundant material they had, it was the American armies that left the most spoils of war in their rear, and the French and Tunisian civilian population greatly benefited from this. As a general rule, the most valuable material was the one that could be reused in some agricultural or construction task. The most striking case of this can be found both in Normandy and in Poland or certain parts of Russia, where even today war material continues to appear that some civilian kept in his house. On the other hand, the civilians did not limit him only to taking possession of the abandoned material, but on some occasions they stole it directly from the army on duty. Again, it was the United States Army that suffered the most theft, because it had so many supplies that it did not pay much attention to its waste. There are numerous reports from the time, in which the officers complain about the great loss of material that was taking place, because it ended up being lost along the way, either due to theft or carelessness. And finally, on many occasions, some forgotten corpse ended up being buried by the civilians of the place. As an anecdote, one of the things that always catches my attention is that objects that were once destroyed and discarded on these battlefields due to their lack of value, today would have a tremendously high price. In any case, I hope that this matter has been interesting for you, and that you have more or less clear what happened when a battle ended. Obviously, and as we have mentioned, there are many variables and the same thing did not always happen, but we have tried to make a summary. Finally, I have to say that as it is evident I have not been able to put hard images of how a battlefield looks like since they can censor the video, but you can easily search for it on the internet. And without further ado, we say goodbye here. Thank you all, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.